So, John Reed, live at Salesforce Connections. I got a special guest. I'm excited. I got Rebecca Wettemann. How you doing?
I'm excited to be with you.
CEO of Valoir.
Yeah.
I hope I got that kind of right. Anyway, we were just talking about returning home to your lovely dog, Patrick, who's the social media darling of the family.
Definitely it's not me.
But before we do that, while we're still amidst our sleep hangovers here in Chicago, we're going to try to make sense of what just happened this week. So, Rebecca, what just happened this week?
Marketing Cloud next, and all the assorted fixings, I would say.
Right. And Marketing Cloud next, I like the tagline that they were using around the end of no reply marketing, because I think that's something everyone can relate to, right? Like, as a consumer, how many times do we have to put up with this, no reply crap? If you ever tried to send an email back and then you see the address and it says no reply and you're like, oh, F you very much. But then for brands too, it feels sometimes a little tone deaf to be blasting things out all the time. So Salesforce making the argument that we can move beyond that now for a variety of technical reasons, including Agentforce, which will create essentially conversations from that. I don't think they're trying to relive the social conversation nostalgia that came up in our watch party.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they mean conversation like that, but I think they mean interacting around things you care about, courtesy to data that Agentforce has about you, that you can kind of have this nice back and forth and get what you want. Is that kind of what we're talking about here? Or?
It's interesting that you frame the question that way, I think, John, because I bet if you polled 100 people here,
right,
you would get 80 different answers on what the end of no reply marketing means.
Yeah.
And I think there's some really interesting and compelling stuff around being able to have an agent that interacts as well as sort of a low-level BDR would if they're interacting with that customer. I think the challenge is not just does it give a correct response, but does it really improve that customer engagement? Does it really have the kind of quality of tone, quality of answer, quality of, for lack of a better term, don't shoot the messenger personalization that customers are looking for.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really interesting things about it is that I was talking with a couple executives in Salesforce about this, how it sort of raises the stakes, right? Because if you're going to claim to listen to people, then you actually have to do that and show them that they can get a result from those conversations. So it's not all upside and happiness there. They got to prove that they can do it.
Mm-hmm. And it's also about having a much more connected view of the customer. Because as much as Salesforce talks about Customer 360, let's face it, most of the folks who were at this conference were responsible for websites or email marketing or branding or messaging strategy, not the sort of omni-channel, how do we interact with a customer across multiple touch points in a dynamic and flexible way. And I think it's going to take a lot of kind of thought leadership from Salesforce now that it's pulled all the text together onto one stack to start bring those different committees, those different groups, and those different people together in one conversation.
So Agentforce was formally launched in 2024, October actually, Agentforce 1.0. And you've kind of been tracking all this ever since. So how would you sort of characterize the evolution of that from here until now?
So, I think we're still very early on in the adoption phase. What we found with Agentforce and the customers that we looked at sort of in early part of this year, sort of January, mid-February, is early adopters were able to dramatically accelerate the process of getting effective and productive agents out the door versus kind of cobbling together open source or Copilot or DIY pieces. They were also able to get to a much higher degree of accuracy than they could with those DIY pieces. But I think the fact that so many people tried to do things before Agentforce was here and found that it was really hard, that it was really messy, and that it had a lot of failures, meant that we've set the bar for pretty low right now for what an Agentforce agent is actually supposed to do. So I think the challenge for Salesforce first it's got to get that next set of customers that tried something that failed miserably before to try to trust this technology again. But second, it's got to start having customers think about, what is the goal here? Is the goal just call deflection? Is the goal just an accurate answer? Or is it really about what ultimately is a better experience for the customer? And I think right now we're sort of in the middle. As long as the answer is pretty much accurate, that's deemed a thumbs up. And I don't think that's where we should be setting our sights.
Yeah, that's a really interesting issue too, because it appears to me that these tools can be used for good or for ill in a sense, right? And I was a little worried because I had an interview yesterday with Engine, which is in the travel industry, and when I'm not really crazy about like agentic AI for like booking travel and stuff like that, and in general, they were working on some things, including like streamlining service things, and I don't like a lot of the headcount reduction stuff that comes out of this. I don't feel that I understand operational efficiency is part of the equation for companies, but I feel like there's so much more that can happen that's better than that if you do this right. And it was really interesting to talk with a customer that actually had thought through that, and it turned out this company, Engine, has thought through a lot of those things. And, you know, in their case, like, they're not getting rid of people. They're actually like expanding roles, hiring new people, hiring more salespeople, even though they put in like a bot to help with some of that stuff the way we saw on stage this week. So it's interesting, right? Organizational philosophy is part of this too. Like, how are you going to use these tools is a really big issue.
Well, it's interesting too when you think about across some of the different departments and technology areas, right? So human resources never likes to talk about increase in productivity because to them that means a loss of headcount. Historically, that's what it's meant for HR. And I think things have shifted a little bit in the recent past. But if I say productivity to sales and marketing leaders, they think growth, they think profit, they think a bigger seat at the at the corporate table. You know, they don't think of it necessarily in terms of that sort of zero-sum game that HR might. I think customer service is another area where people have been very focused on what is the headcount reduction opportunity, and not the fact that you're always going to have 20% of cases that really, to be handled well, need an individual and not just a low-level phone person, but somebody who can really understand the product, understand the company, and understand the customer.
So one of the things I like about what you do is that you periodically come out with research, and then you make predictions, which we all see on LinkedIn, you know, based on a lot of that. So how is your research on these topics kind of stacked up with what you've heard this week?
I think, to borrow a term from a good friend of mine, that right now AI adoption has outpaced understanding. And the winner in this from a vendor perspective may not necessarily be the one that's out ahead first or the one that has the best tech, but the one that can really help customers understand and articulate what it is that they get from a value perspective and how it impacts the way they manage customers, employees, operations, supply chains, or the whole 9 yards. It's going to be about understanding the technology and understanding how the humans may or may not need to adapt to it. That's going to be really the value driver and the long-term kind of stickiness factor here.
So how do customers that are not as like leading edge on Agentforce get there? I think you were raising earlier the prospect of folks who might be even looking at Marketing Cloud next, but aren't quite ready for Agentforce. Like, how do they think about this in a way that makes sense for them, rather than like, just kind of feeling like they're missing out on the action? How do they prepare for this better?
I think one of the gaps in what we heard that could be better articulated over the past 2 days, that answers is a long way to answer your question, is what is in it for today's Marketing Cloud customer that is not going to Agentforce in the foreseeable future with Next. And the reality is, if you break it down a little bit, there are a lot of things there. There are things around doing less scripting. There are things around doing less data synchronization. There are a number of things that you get, even just doing a one-to-one migration with what you have to next, that reduce your cost of ownership, increase your ability to innovate, increase your ability to leverage data, those
Mhm.
sorts of things that you get even if you don't ever look at Agent. And I think it's important that Salesforce continues to talk about those things so that existing customer base doesn't feel like it's being left behind or being ignored.
Yeah, I think it's really been a challenge for vendors this spring to sort of give the forward vision that they want folks to feel like, "Oh, we are gonna be your go-to for this," so that, you know, all these vendors are worried that they could become kind of the back end database for someone else's agent, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they wanna have this forward thing, but did you also get the message out around all the other ways you can be successful on our platform? And I'm not sure Salesforce got that this week.
I would say they are better off from a messaging perspective than they were at, say, TDX
Mm,
around the messaging. But I think there's got to be a clear path for customers that aren't ready or willing for whatever reason to feel like they're getting the return on their Salesforce investment. And there are compelling things in Next and in the latest version of Service Cloud and in Sales Cloud and in some of the other pieces of the overall Salesforce portfolio that get lost if all Salesforce wants to talk about is Agentforce. I think we've seen Mark pull back a little bit from that in the past couple of months. If you talk about like what they're talking about now with Service Cloud, where they're talking about an agent as an assistant sitting beside the agent, dramatically different than what we were talking about, in the fall or even in December with Agentforce 2.0. And I think that's a reaction to understanding that you've got an incredibly loyal customer base that needs to continue to feel that you're investing in them, even if they're not necessarily keeping pace with you on the AI front.
yeah, it was interesting for me to hit a bunch of customer sessions yesterday and take the pulse. And I definitely, got the perception that customers really like the overall direction. I think some of that stems from what you alluded to earlier in your research around how customers have really struggled with this on their own, like putting in their own chatbots and trying to construct their. And I was telling a Salesforce CMO I can understand where customers are coming from because I geek out on this stuff a lot. So I watch like these in-depth videos on how to construct a RAG architecture and stuff, and like all the different elements that are kind of being put onto these language models in order to make them do something that's more enterprisey and relevant. And I was thinking to myself watching some of these, like, how could the average customer ever build and maintain this architecture, especially with LLMs being moving targets and constantly changing and evolving? Like, I can see how Salesforce can stay on top of something like that, or Oracle, SAP, Workday, you name
Yeah.
it. But or even Zoho or what have you. But but for a typical customer to manage that,
I'll tell you, when we talked to customers for the early study that we did, comparing sort of those that had done DIY efforts to those who had done something with Agentforce, it was so much. It wasn't just a matter of time to market. It was a matter of most of them believe they would never be able to build the capabilities of the trust layer, the guardrails, but also that even with their own DIY efforts, they could never get to a level of accuracy that was even acceptable to get it out to the door. It sort of reminds me of the early days of cloud, though, when everybody thought they should still be running everything on-prem. And
mm,
Salesforce was crazy because they said, no, there's a better, more effective, more efficient way to do this. This doesn't tap sort of unlimited infrastructure resources. Kind of reminds me of that. And I think we're seeing the shift from the sort of hubris of IT saying we should own AI because we're the programmers, to prompt engineering is not coding. And there's a lot of other pieces that, we're probably better off having a vendor manage those economies and those economies of scale.
the catch, of course, is that you don't get off the hook with your data. Now, granted, Salesforce has solutions for that, and I want to get to Informatica in a second too.
Yeah.
But so Salesforce has a lot of answers in terms of data platform. But I was struck going to some of these sessions yesterday that that's the issue that customers were bringing up the most in terms of what was stopping them from moving ahead. And so, in other words, like, I went to one session where customers were talking about use cases and business cases, and both of those were easier for them than the data piece and trying to understand better how to get the right data into these systems. And so that's the one part that I think customers are still trying to figure out. And obviously Salesforce thinks they have some answers there, but
Yeah.
what is your take on that?
I think it's the data piece, but it's also the process piece,
Mhm.
right? For customers that have already built out robust flows that reflect their actual work processes and
Mhm.
have all their data in Salesforce, it's relatively easy to turn on an Agentforce agent. It's also relatively easy once you do that to see where your data and your processes fall short. Because when you test your agent, it's going to tell you, right? It's going to give you the wrong answer. But that means kind of for those that don't have all their data and their flows in place, they're kind of shooting in the dark a little bit. And what makes it even more complicated is if I'm looking at things like availability to promise based on information that is in a supply chain application or in my ERP, the ability of a customer to pay as an input into what kind of offers I want to make them, which is again going to a finance or a billing application. If I'm going outside of what I can reasonably bring in from a content perspective with RAG or from CRM data, yes, the technology is there to do it with Salesforce. Like the pipes are there, but you still have to have a pretty good plumber to
Mhm.
to actually get that faucet to run and get it to fuel that AI in a meaningful way. And that's where we see customers saying, like, I don't really know what I need to bring in from ERP or the best way to structure that. Yes, I have zero copy options, certainly, but there's still issues about how much data I have to bring in to inform my AI to get to that right level of decision making. And I think there's more from a technical perspective that needs to be done, as a segue to your next question, but also from a knowledge and thought leadership question to help customers understand. Because even if you ask the data cloud team today, they'll talk in general terms about ERP, other data, bringing it in, but you don't see a lot of examples of customers doing that successfully.
Mm. So, what do you think customers need to do to advance on this issue? If you were advising a customer who's obviously they're in different places with this, but if you talked about needing a pretty good plumber, is there certain things you think they should do to move ahead with this?
Well, I think the beyond sort of the MuleSoft and the unification kind of capabilities that are in Data Cloud, I think Informatica will bring a lot there.
Mhm.
Sort of the data integration, data cleanliness, data hygiene, data consistency, data governance chops that Informatica brings to the table, I think will be a really important piece in filling in that hole for Salesforce and for its customers. I think there's an opportunity too for Salesforce and or Informatica, hopefully in the shorter term, to start providing some of those blueprints, some of those diagrams to help customers understand if I'm thinking about this kind of agentic use case and my data is here, this is the best way to bring it in. This is the best way to architect it. And I'm thinking about, you know, the challenge with a lot of that is everybody's ERP system is different,
Mm.
right? Everybody's done customizations differently and that sort of thing. But I think we have to start being more prescriptive in the, at least, here's how you should think about bringing it in so customers can start to tackle it.
Yeah, and as far as Informatica is concerned, I think you emphasized that getting started early part because in the timeline, it probably won't close if it goes as planned until 2027 fiscal year for Salesforce. But to your point, I think a customer could legitimately invest in some of that tooling ahead of time. And I think were maybe, I think somewhat bullish on the acquisition. I noticed a lot of mixed sort of all over the place. Some folks really liking it, some folks scratching their heads around it. Can you explain for our listeners just a little bit about why because some folks have said, well, there's a lot of overlap in functionality between Informatica and MuleSoft or Data Cloud, whatever. Why do you think this Informatica has some key pieces that Salesforce doesn't have? Because I think you said that it does have a few things.
Yeah, I mean, with MuleSoft, you certainly have connectors, and Informatica has connectors. Yes, there's no. With Data Cloud, you've got unification and harmonization of data. Absolutely. What you don't have is the decades of experience that Informatica has going back to old school data warehouses of master data management, as data governance and quality, and these sort of really hard problems that happen at a granular level in the database. And that, if you think about data as being sort of one of the foundational pieces of making AI work properly, it's got to be of greater depth and robustness. That's what than I necessarily get with Data Cloud, particularly if I'm thinking about bringing in financial data, supply chain data, all those sorts of things to answer some of these more complex questions.
Yeah, that seems to be a really crucial point, right? That some of the initial use cases might be more marketing centric or marketing cloud centric, but in the long run, one of the challenges of AI for vendors is, I think of it like this boomerang effect, where if you give someone a prompt and let them ask a question, they're going to kind of expect that they can get the answer, right? Which includes wherever they don't want to hear like, well, we can partially answer that question, but we don't have access to this data. They're going to customers are going to want all those data sources in that answer, right? And so when you take a step back, that helps you to, I think, understand at least what Salesforce thinks they're accomplishing with this acquisition, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a set of data management and government complexities that level or operate at a different granularity and, dare I say, a different level of sophistication. Nothing wrong with Data Cloud and MuleSoft today, but we're talking about an entire tool set that they get with Informatica rather than a few sort of common use purpose tools.
Yeah, I don't know if you did this while you were here, but yesterday I built an agent. I'm not gonna show off too much. It was kind of a where's my order agent. It was but honestly, it was, basic, like low coding kind of thing for me. Like I was able to do it without much of a problem. But what I was struck by while doing it was all the different choices that I had navigating through the Salesforce agent builder environment around like different data sources I could potentially plug in to this agent. And I was once again reminded that that's sort of the key here, right? Like it's nice that I could build that really quickly, but if I went home and tried to do that on my own computer, the biggest problem I would run into would be, what am I going to connect it to that's actually going to be meaningful and useful to me,
And even basic stuff like if I'm talking about supply chain and availability to promise, how far of a time frame should I be looking out? Is it a function of my overall, inventory? Is it a function of distance from the source? There's sorts of things that are sort of deeper data questions that don't have anything to do with CRM per se, that are going to be important for customers to manage their overall kind of query cost and query load and that sort of thing. But also think about where that data sits, where the latency is. What's the most effective way for me to bring it in? How frequently do I bring it in? Right? How current does it need to be? All of those sorts of things that are bigger kind of data governance questions that are beyond the realm of what most the folks are thinking about when they think about connecting with MuleSoft connecting or even bringing data into Data Cloud.
I have some really strong views on the topic of personalization. If someone brings it up, I will definitely.
Are you going to get hyper?
I could get hyper. I wanted to ask you just in general, what is your take on this? It came up a fair amount in the last couple of days. Like, do you think this is something that marketers should be striving for and achieve and try to achieve? I have some pros and cons on that, but
I think it's not the marketer's job. I think moving forward, it is not about personalization. I think marketers have treated personas as personalization, which it is not.
Mm-hmm.
I think moving forward, it's going to be the job of the marketer to create and curate those compelling pieces of content and micro content, and enable a customer to decide through a conversational agent what they're interested, what they want to see, and what engages them. Right? So the whole journey thing, we've had conversation about
Yes, we
this.
did. We did.
this.
And check our watch party replay on Brent Leary's feed, because I was giving Paul Greenberg a hard time because I said, "You hate journeys." He's like, "I don't hate journeys, but I hate journey builders." But it was the same kind of thing. He was objecting to the static nature of the journey versus the typical customer behavior. So same concept.
Yeah. So I have one of those old Rand McNally maps
Yeah.
of the state of Virginia in my car. I also have Waze. Right? Both are good for certain things, but a lot of times marketers are standing around with triptychs and maps.
They got the Rand McNally map, yeah.
When they should be letting the customer turn on Waze and figure out where they want to go.
Really like what you're saying there, and I think, I did a whole video series on hyper-personalization, and I'll probably do more, just trying to get to the bottom of when does it work and when doesn't it work. And one of the big conclusions I came to, there was still a lot of open questions, but one of the things was don't overreach, don't try too hard. And the algorithms that seem most effective to me, like for example, the YouTube algorithm, it works so well because it doesn't try to point me towards the one thing that I might want to see. What it does is it shows me this kind of, canvas of all these different possibilities that some of them reflect my most recent clicks, but some of them also go back into history a little bit and almost like surprise me with something that I was into a few months ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just got a really brilliant way of like not trying too hard to pick the one thing. And in a weird way, and I hate to say something so positive about agentic AI because I'm usually so grouchy, but like agentic AI might let marketers off the hook a little bit on this in a good way, right? Because now you don't have to like pick that perfect email for Rebecca based on Rebecca's moods, right? You can reach out and say, hey, we wanted to check in with you about, we know you've stayed at this hotel in the past, but are you thinking about this in the future? Whatever. If you trust that bot, right, which is a big issue, and you want to engage with that bot, well, you're kind of off the hook from trying to guess what you want now because you're going to be interacting.
I can spend that whole budget for A/B testing on something else entirely.
Yeah. Right?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think for the marketer that's tried to figure out like what the perfect campaign is, or the sliced and diced personas ad infinitum, like, did that really get me any closer? But I think the other thing to remember too is there's a very fine line between personalized and creepy.
Right. Yep.
And I can only overstep that line once or twice before I start to really piss customers off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas, some of the stuff that we've seen here this week and some of the stuff that to me was the most compelling was I don't go to a static website anymore. I go to a conversational interface that is then serving me up content based on what I'm asking about. And if I authenticate who I am. So if I have a technical question about a product, it might serve me up a product spec, right? If I have a question about availability, it might show me store locations. If I have a question about something else or a complaint, it might offer me some other sort of content or a coupon, right? Or access to a loyalty program. All of those kind of things that are customer driven, the Waze example, as opposed to marketer led.
So we're taking some of the hype off personalization, we're putting it onto agentic AI to come through where personalization didn't. But it's an interesting concept, right? Because it does kind of make sense, right? Like, put me in conversation with a bot that is smart enough, at least to basically understand what I want, and like you said, deliver certain things in real time that I might care about. Different views, different ideas, different sizes, different store locations I hadn't thought of, like solve my problems for me, like, and don't try to predict what I'm doing in this moment, but ask me,
Mhm.
you know? Has a lot of potential. I'll see a lot of pitfalls, but I have to say I like it better than just picking the perfect email for John Reed, because that doesn't work.
I think there's an interesting vision there. I think there's some things that we have to execute on to get there,
Yeah.
right? But boy, I'd love that than
Yeah.
another dear Mr. Wettemann email,
Oh my God. Right. Or like you said, the creepy factor of trying too hard can really set you back. And of course, the internet's full of all the disasters brands have gotten into along
Sure,
those lines.
sure.
Okay. So, by the way, for listeners, I didn't totally succeed in finding the quietest spot. So hopefully the background noise isn't too bad for you. This was the best I could do at this event. But just to wrap, Rebecca, we got Dreamforce in the fall. So what do you think Salesforce needs to do to kind of take what we learned here and have a successful, their signature event? What kinds of things they need to carry forward or do differently?
I think one of the things that I heard that I really liked this week was the admission that building agents is not simple.
Mm.
I think being honest about the complexity, yes, it's easy, as you said, to spin up an agent, right? I can do that with a conversational interface. Getting it to give customer appropriate quality answers at scale in a meaningful way is complicated. It's okay to admit that, but I think that's an important part, to having customers feel like if they've tried to do this and not been successful on the first try, that they're alone, right? Salesforce is going to need to bring customers along with them, and that's going to be acknowledging that A, sometimes this stuff is more complicated than we may have initially said, and B, there are investments, resources, other things to bring you along at the pace that you're comfortable with, and that may be just with a human in the loop at this point. And let's not underestimate the potential value of some of those capabilities.
All right. So we'll stay tuned then. You've got an adorable dog waiting for you. I've got an article deadline waiting for me. We could both use some sleep, I think, at this point. Thanks for helping me to make sense of the show. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, John.
Appreciate
This was
it.
fun.